Hail and welcome! My name is Sierra Cassidy, and I am a Canadian smut author here to educate and entertain smut writers and readers. Today, we're talking about the Omegaverse. Do you want to read or write Omegaverse? Do you have no idea what the fuck it is? Fear not, I will guide you through this vast wilderness of chaos that is the Omegaverse. While I have your attention, I just wanted to let you know that if you're consuming this episode, that means that the Nikki and the Night Owls duet is officially live. If you like sweet and spicy polyamorous Omegaverse, then you can find the links to those two books below. Now let's get on with the info. Omegaverse, or ABO as it's sometimes known, once began as a singular trope and has evolved into a full-blown subgenre that can claim its place under a variety of genres. Today, we're going to be specifically discussing the Omegaverse in terms of erotica and romance. Everything within this subgenre is highly subject to the whims of individual authors, leading to each Omegaverse being heavily customized. There are basically no rules. However, there are definite commonalities, which is what we'll be talking about today. What is the Omegaverse? There is no simple answer to this. The only basic requirement for something to be Omegaverse is the inclusion of the secondary genders of alpha, beta, and omega. Everything beyond that is up to the author. There are plenty of elements that are extremely common, but none of them are explicitly required for something to be Omegaverse. Because everything is so dependent on the author, everything that is mentioned in this episode will obviously have exceptions. What are secondary genders? The secondary genders, also called dynamics or designations, of alpha, beta, and omega are literally just that, genders. But different from the primary genders of man, woman, non-binary, agender, etc. Omegaverse stories can have any combination of biological sex, primary gender, and secondary gender. Typically, betas are the most common secondary gender, alphas are usually the next most populous and are more commonly male, omegas are usually the rarest of the three secondary genders and are more commonly female. However, those are not hard and fast rules by any means, and every world is different in how the designations are divided up. Common elements in alphas. Alphas tend to more often be in positions of elevated authority and leadership. The world building usually sets them up to succeed and makes it easy for them to climb the various social ladders. They also tend to be physically larger than the other designations. They may have something which is called a bark. The bark allows them to order other designations and can be anywhere from something that snaps people to attention to something that straight up overrides the free will of others in regards to the order. If the Omegaverse is more primal, then alphas may be viewed as more volatile and less able to control themselves. They tend to have an innate desire to serve omegas, to protect them, and ensure that their needs are met. They are usually more dominant in relationships. They may experience ruts, which are periods of profound hormonal spikes that drive them to copulate. They are also able to impregnate others regardless of their own biological sex, assuming their partner can get pregnant, of course. Common elements in betas. Betas are usually just regular people who are unaffected by the hormonal cycles that rule the lives of alphas and omegas. They may be devalued in the world building because they're not considered to be special like alphas and omegas. Common elements in omegas. Omegas are usually the submissive in the relationship. They tend to have less control over their bodies compared to alphas and betas, and typically experience heat cycles. Like the alpha's rut, these are periods of hormonal spikes that drive the omega to copulate and produce offspring. Some world-building places omegas at the bottom of the pecking order, in some cases barring them from holding jobs, etc. If there was an excuse used to prevent women from doing something in society, that logic is usually placed onto omegas in these situations. All omegas can be impregnated regardless of their primary gender or biological sex. Common elements in the Omegaverse. Scent. Scent is a big thing in the Omegaverse. Characters are likely to engage in scent marking or masking. Their scent may have an influence on their partner or those around them, and characters are likely to have a signature scent. Scent marking focuses around the scent glands, usually present on the throat, the wrists, and/or the inner thigh. This is usually the "this person is mine" calling card of someone's partner. Scent masking involves covering the scent of another. This is usually done by an alpha to an omega. In most cases, this will be as a form of protection to mask the scent of an omega getting too near to their heat. Scent can influence characters, usually in the form of relaxing them, turning them on, or encouraging submission. Alphas usually have more control over their scent and can manipulate it for those purposes. Omegas usually don't have control over their scent. Betas might notice the scents but are far less likely to be affected by them. Signature scents can usually be anything that's pleasant. Usually alphas will be given quote-unquote stronger scents, leather, cinnamon, ginger, smoke, etc. And omegas will be given quote-unquote softer scents, flowers, fruit, sweet things, etc. If it's a more primal Omegaverse, then scent can be used by omegas to attract a mate, and alphas are able to track down omegas by their scent. Scents can also be used to denote stress in the characters by having the scent turn sharp, sour, or burnt. Mates. Mating in Omegaverse isn't simply fucking. It has a whole lot of layers, including things like bonding, claiming, marking, whether those things are voluntary, the effects of being a mate, etc. When someone is mated in the Omegaverse, they quote-unquote belong to their partner. Bonding is usually a two-way link where both partners decide that they want to be mates and will bond one another. In some verses, this will provide a telepathic or intuitive link. Claiming is a one-way street where one partner, usually the alpha, decides that they want a particular omega and can claim them, usually by biting one of the scent glands. Marking is usually a temporary brand, usually a bite, that displays to others someone is taken. Fated mates, above and beyond regular mates, are also very common in Omegaverse. These might also come up in the form of scent-matched mates, or similar, in which they're not really fated, but the biological response is really strong to let them know they have high compatibility. Heats and ruts. The world building surrounding the heat and rut cycles are always fascinating to me. There are a few variations that commonly appear. Alphas and omegas being completely at the whims of their hormones, unable to safely predict or manage their symptoms. There might be use of birth control, hormonal suppressants, and extensive medical care that enable alphas and omegas to live relatively normal lives. And sometimes heats and ruts are unpredictable and can show up without warning, usually triggered by their partner or a nearby opposite dynamic. These spontaneous heats and ruts can be dangerous both for the partner experiencing them and for those around them. What goes on in heat? The most common aspects are scent changes, nesting, and the heat haze. Scent changes tend to be indicative of hormonal shifts. Depending on the world building, the population at large might be able to tell when an omega is going to be quote-unquote in season, and in others it might only be their family or partner that is familiar enough with them to notice the changes. Nesting is a general omega behavior that is a response to stress. If omegas are stressed, pregnant, have young children, or are children themselves, or are going into heat, they will nest to reduce their stress. Nesting involves the gathering of soft fabrics and other items and turning them into, well, a nest. It allows the omega to chill in a comfortable environment that also smells like their partner or family if they're unpartnered and helps them relax. In some worlds, the alphas may have a nest in their home even if they don't yet have an omega, simply to anticipate their eventual omega. The heat haze is when the heat is in full swing and the omega is no longer in control of themselves. Sometimes it's accompanied by an actual fever and the omega is essentially delirious until enough stimulation/orgasms have happened to lower the hormone levels. Once the heat haze has passed, the omega is usually fairly lucid, albeit extremely horny for the remainder of the heat. Most of the heat is sex, with the original intention to get the omega pregnant, but that doesn't always happen in every story. Sex in the Omegaverse. The Omegaverse can get spicy. It's a genre that lends itself well to primal kink, breeding kink, knotting, dom and sub dynamics, and mpreg. If you're reading Omegaverse, the odds are high you're going to encounter at least one of those in each story. Once you delve into the heats and ruts, you're going to fall pretty hard and fast into primal and breeding kinks. Heats and ruts tend to make characters desperately horny beyond the point they can reasonably control, and the main purpose of a heat, biologically speaking, not necessarily for the story, is to produce offspring. Things are likely to get growly, bitey, and probably have some power play going on. If the Omegaverse is a more primal one to begin with, then you might even have an alpha hunting down their omega partner. Knotting is where the base of the penis swells to essentially trap the participants together. In nature, it's to increase the chances of conception and occurs in canine species, which is part of why the Omegaverse is super popular for werewolves and shifters. I know there's a whole subset of erotica readers that are into unique dicks, so Omegaverse could be a place where you can sate that desire. Dom and sub dynamics are pretty common in the Omegaverse as far as I've noticed. Depending on the Omegaverse, you're gonna find a lot of power play. Alphas are usually the doms, and their whole job during the heat is to care for the omega and also to fuck them senseless. Another thing that's very common in Omegaverse is mpreg, short for male pregnancy, because omegas of all genders and sexes can get pregnant. If you've got a pregnancy kink, then you're likely to find something that floats your boat in these stories. Dubcon and non-con in Omegaverse. Because of the nature of heats and ruts, dubcon and non-con, short for dubious consent and non-consent, can be very common within this subgenre. Consent lines get very blurry when it's the hormones driving decisions and not any kind of rational thought. Heats and ruts are not experiences that the characters can ignore. They will overwhelm inhibitions, provoke uncontrolled bodily responses, and require attention and care to get through. If an omega goes into heat, they are very likely to beg the nearest alpha, or anyone, to fuck them. They need sexual stimulation to get the hormonal overload to dissipate. In some worlds, the heat symptoms can be physically painful, and not acting on them leads the omega to suffer. In a rut, some alphas may get more aggressive and possessive toward omegas, some get violent, and some will grab the nearest person to fuck. So, now that you've listened to all of this, you might be asking yourself, Sierra, what the heck do you write in the Omegaverse? The Omegaverse is incredibly flexible. You can apply pretty much any storyline, any kinks and dynamics you want, and it'll work within the world. It's fun and can be entertaining as hell, but it can be hard to find what you're looking for. Because of the flexibility, authors can cherry pick any elements, so like with most things, you'll have to wade through a lot to find gems that fit your exact taste. With that being said, let me introduce you to the Omegaverse that I work with. I try to focus on consent and do my best in the stories to work around the potential dubcon aspects that come with Omegaverse. Whether that's to have the characters already getting frisky when a heat comes up, signing a heat contract, or accessing heat services, you don't have to worry about anything squicky occurring for the most part. The alphas, betas, and omegas in my verse are equal in society. None have any restrictions when it comes to jobs or healthcare. They all have full access to birth control, and there is no world stigma against any of the dynamics. My alphas do, on average, lean more to the dom side, and my omegas lean more to the sub side, but that's not a hard and fast rule by any means. And I write versatile characters more often than not, with different kinks and behaviors coming out depending on who they're playing with. I created the Heat Helpers, which are specialized sex workers that are trained in omega care, and often work in healthcare as well. The heat helpers show up in several stories, and they're basically guaranteed to give their Omega partners a fabulous time. The first heat, as appears in First Heat, an Omega goes through is the most chaotic, and the older an Omega gets, particularly if they're bonded, the more manageable their heats usually become. A spontaneous heat, as appears in Conference Confidential, is an occurrence in my verse that happens when ideal mates get frisky. It's unplanned, unpredictable, and thankfully not as intense as a traditional heat. Ideal mates are alpha and omega pairs that are maximum biological compatibility, regardless of personal compatibility. A stress heat, as appears in Heat, Play, Love, is, like it says, stress-induced. In the same way that stress can throw us out of whack, so too can stress mess up an omega cycle and trigger the heat early. A feature of my verse is that people can bond more than one partner, which leaves things open for long-term polyamorous relationships like you'll see in Nikki and the Night Owls. Bonding itself is a permanent and irreversible act. In order to avoid accidental bonding, I've introduced alpha collars, which protect the most common scent gland that's used for a first bonding. That allows the omegas to still enjoy being claimed, but there's no risk of their partner being bonded. I also really wanted all of the designations to be able to bond with one another, as in a lot of stories I encountered it was a one-way bond and was often entirely in the control of a single designation. The only stipulation with mine is that the bonding has to take place during an omega's heat, since those hormones make it all possible. And a final fun note about my Omegaverse is that they're still making new discoveries all the time, and the designations are being actively studied, so you can expect lots of neat things to pop up. That's all for now. I will definitely be expanding on the Omegaverse in other episodes. There's tons more to cover that I can't possibly squeeze in here. You can find all of my books and platforms in the description below. If you have questions or suggestions for future episodes, please do let me know. And if you'd like early access to these, you can join my Patreon where I share them with people as soon as they're ready to roll. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you soon for another episode. Bye!